Hello, City of Canby. Thank you for joining us at the Monday, September 11th, 2023 Canby Planning Commission meeting. We will start our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We have a consent item, which is adopting the draft meeting minutes for May 8th, 2023. We are going to push that adoption of those minutes to the next scheduled meeting, which is September the 25th, just to ensure that we have quorum among those that were actually present for that meeting. Next item up will be citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to questions raised during citizens input before the meeting ends or as quickly as possible thereafter. Do we have any items from for citizen input? Seeing none online or in person, we'll move forward with new business. There is none, so we will then move to public hearings. There is none, and that takes us to our Planning Commission work session. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to discuss an administrative variance process. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the two opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decisions in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. Director Hardy, please take it away and talk to us about administrative variance discussions.
Thank you, Chair Ellison and Commissioners. Good evening. Tonight, we're going to discuss administrative minor variances. We have some provision in our Canby code on this already. We'll be going through that. Maybe as an overarching review of this, I see kind of twofold elements here. There's like day-to-day administrative items that come up, which sometimes things don't fit the strict literal part of the code, and sometimes there's minor deviations that are needed for developments. Our code is extremely restrictive on that, and many times those have to be elevated to a Type 3 Planning Commission hearing for things that might be rather minor. That could be like a minor setback issue or something else that our code just does not give any latitude on. So we have those situations, and then also in context of the housing efficiency measures, and specifically Commissioner Ewert's comments about infill. We've also had some people that have participated in the process on housing efficiency measures speak about the challenges where you're slightly off on lot size. So same situation where if there was a small deviation, let's say it's 10% deviation to the standard, they could fit another lot on a piece of property, and that could help with infill. It could also help with housing affordability. Broad brush context, and I'll cover this tonight, is Canby is an outlier in the sense of how restrictive our code is. Almost every jurisdiction, if not every jurisdiction in the metro area, has much more ability to make these kind of adjustments, and most of the time they're administratively approved up to a certain percentage, and I'll be covering that tonight with some adjacent cities and how they process things. I was a little bit surprised when I started looking at the code when I started here that we did not have an administrative adjustment process or a minor variance process, because they often are important as we go through processes, and not to elevate things unnecessarily to a Type 3 public hearing process for something that might be rather benign and minor in its nature. Part of the discussion tonight, though, is to get input from the Planning Commission on what parameters we should come back with. I see this as a conversation that will be one that will take several work sessions to go through about what those parameters should be on adjustments and what our current code allows and what they might be under circumstances, and coming back with more information on those. So with that, Lady, can you go to the next slide, please? So tonight we'll review again the potential administrative variance, minor variance code updates, what can be currently allowed, and identify where administrative variances may be appropriate, and identify what percentage permitted for administrative variances versus those going to public hearing, and consider other cities and administrative variances, and then identify next steps. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just kind of some context again, that administrative variances permit small adjustments to city code standards, and many cities permit up to 10% adjustments to development codes such as lot size, setbacks, building height, maximum impervious surface area, et cetera. And the purpose is to permit, to address unique circumstances. So there would be criteria, and the city code does have criteria for administrative variance. That'd be another item as well, would be, should those criteria for administrative variances, if they were expanded to other things besides setbacks and sign variances, should the criteria remain as they are in the current code for those types of administrative variances? So next slide, please, Lady. So what does the Canby code allow? Currently, the minor variances are granted up to 10%. They're allowed under certain conditions. And one of those is lot configuration or physical conditions of the site. It's proposed in order to preserve a tree or will not result in the removal of significant natural resources, including trees. Variance will not reduce allowable lot size. That's in our code now, so that would be one item that would be something that would be important to discuss on infill. Violate landscaping requirements or result in a violation of other chapters or sections of the ordinance, and the variance will not materially be detrimental to other properties within the same vicinity. So again, the adjustments that what are called minor variances in the Canby code are limited to setbacks and sign sizes. Those are processed as a type 2. Type 2, just for a little thumbnail of type 2, is a administrative process, but it does require notice to neighbors, and a type 2 is appealable to the Planning Commission. The decision is appealable. Versus a type 1, which has no notice and is not appealable. All of the variances are major variances subject to type 3 Planning Commission hearing processes. So major variances, and just kind of going through those, the bar, and you've reviewed some of these where the bar is super high on type 3 Planning Commission, and it's intentional. And in most codes, that's because it's a fairly significant item that people are asking for. They're usually not minor. They're usually more significant. And so with that in mind, we're not suggesting any changes to major variance criteria, but those criteria are substantial. So in context of small changes, should we be having the same bar for those that talk about exceptional or extraordinary circumstances, necessary to assure the same property rights as possessed by other property owners in the city or within the same zone, it would not detrimentally material to the intent or purpose of the city's comprehensive plan or land use development planning ordinance, not materially detrimental to other properties within the same vicinity. The variance requested is the minimum variance, which alleviates the hardship, and the exceptional or unique conditions of the property which necessitate the issuance of a variance were not caused by the applicant or the applicant's employees or relatives. So jumping to other cities, which I think is helpful in trying to navigate through this about what have other cities used. So Oregon City has allowed minor variances, and what we found it was that sometimes it's not like universal where they've decided that 10% for all adjustments is the standard. Sometimes they picked and choose between different types of development standards, and they given different percentages of reduction. So for example, Oregon City allows a 20% variance for setbacks and lot coverage, 5% lot area, and design architectural standards for single-family duplexes and accessory dwelling units, and that is a type 2 process as well as consistent with what Canby is using. West Lynn has a class 1 variance with the director decision, so that's administrative. It's one level below a type 2, permits up to 20% modification to yards, 10% to lot dimensions, and 5% to lot area. All other variances are planning commission decisions. And so then the Oregon State has a model code, and what they suggest at the state level is type 2 process for setbacks, lot coverage, lot dimensional area, lot dimensions, lot area, and other dimensional numeric standards if approval criteria are met. And so the consistency is they're thinking that, and like most of the jurisdictions, their type 2 is what the state is suggesting. Newburgh has a interesting adjustment process. Again, they have a lot of different categories. I did not list all of those, but they are using a type 1 procedure, and they have different standards for different development elements, like setback, lot area, lot coverage, and lot dimensions, and off-street parking. And then Troutdale has a 10% numerical standard under a type 1 process if criteria are met, and a deviation more than 10 to 30% is permitted under a type 2 decision if the criteria are met. And then Sherwood, also like Newburgh, has adjustments for each specific item, setbacks, landscape area, residential design standards, and they are using a type 1 procedure if the criteria are met. So our discussion tonight is, this is going to dive into some more detail and some revisitation of this infill, and unfortunately Commissioner Ewert is yet again not here for the discussion, but on infill, because that's where I'm going with this as one aspect of administrative variances. So the discussion tonight is expanding administrative variances to the development code beyond setbacks and signs, and what other development standards should be included in those administrative variances. Should it include lot size, maximum impervious surface, building heights, et cetera? And what process? Should it be a type 1 or a type 2 administrative process? And again, type 2 would be approved administratively, but subject to appeal if someone wanted to appeal it to the Planning Commission. And then finally, what are the appropriate criteria for approval? So this is diving back into the information I was hoping Commissioner Ewert would see tonight, because I wanted to respect his desire to.
When he comes back, we'll just say roll tape, and then we'll just revisit the recording.
So we did talk about infill, and this is kind of the sample study area, and this is an abbreviated version of what you heard before. But we took a sample area which we felt like was fairly good in terms of representation of larger lots in the city, not the newer developments with smaller lots that probably will never be eligible for administrative variances. So the idea behind this is these would be larger lots that would likely, in the infill concept, would be slightly off the standard. And could you tweak those slightly to allow some more infill opportunities on lots that say are within 10% of the lot area to actually permit them? Okay.
We approved a small apartment in R2 over by the night school or Eccles School in that area. And part of that was the variance in dealing with boundaries coming up against an alleyway. And I remember Greg Parker coming in front of us saying that we really should come up with a standard rule for that sort of thing. And I rode my bike around town, and I found places where, like, businesses had built literally up to the line where you could build and still have a vehicle go down that road, so much so that you wouldn't enter. I mean, you couldn't put a door that way. It had to open parallel to the space. And fences going up to it and fuse around corners, and I really couldn't see any property that had an alleyway behind it as following any kind of standard process. And thinking that that's quite a lot of properties to kind of bog down the planning commission. And so had you thought about just having an alleyway as one of the property boundaries as being a criteria for this sort of process?
that specific application, there could be many, and that was not necessarily one that came to mind. I was thinking of the gentleman that attended one of the work sessions, and I went up to him afterwards because I'm never really sure what people are watching for what purpose. And he was a contractor and then did a lot of infill development, and he had a situation where he was just very slightly short of the acreage. So like, let's say, and I don't know the exact circumstance, but let's say it's a 7,000 square foot lot requirement in an R1, and he has 6,300 square feet of a lot. Should that provision be allowed where he would, that's essentially almost the same thing in my mind. 6,300 versus 7,000 is super, super close. And that would give that ability for, that's a niche market, but it's probably going to become even more of a niche market unless we see an adjustment to the housing prices. I mean, so that would be a circumstance where I would say arguably materially that would not have a negative effect on that area if it was a small adjustment. So it was more, that was more in context, but alleyways are clearly, I mean, what, we can go any direction on this about where it would and would not apply. To be honest with you, we've had circumstances where this has come across the board from commercial, residential, industrial. It's really, it hamstrings in many ways not having the ability to adjust things and throwing people right into a variance process, which I think is not necessarily a good exercise of the process. If our code is that far off that you have to go through a public variance process for a small adjustment, there's something wrong with our code. That's my personal opinion.
Well, and that and along the same lines with just any lot that's not profoundly rectangular. Excuse me, where, the place where the sidewalk is going to have to go if you want to put in a decent sized property that's useful to a regular person, then, maybe because the lot, narrows down at one end, there's space to move the sidewalk, a little closer to the street, and, and things of that nature is what I was thinking of when I saw, I think earlier on in this, you were talking about adjusting, numerical, what was the term?
Standards.
Numerical standards.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that's, when you're talking about that, you're talking about the entire dimensions of the property, right? So it's essentially any kind of standard that you could see where, by fudging the numbers by a couple of feet, that somebody could build something that is more to our liking.
And I think it's really trying to, one, keep the compatibility. So, I mean, those criteria are still important, and I'm not suggesting we have zero criteria, but essentially there would still be a process and a measured way of addressing it. So there would still be projects that might not meet that criteria and would not be eligible. But just kind of my global experience is that it makes it super difficult to have any kind of latitude on things that might be something that the city would encourage, but it suddenly becomes this giant hearing process, which is not only expensive and intimidating, but it feels like the level of scrutiny is sometimes maybe perhaps beyond what it should be.
Well, and that's what I was thinking with that one property in particular. It
Yep.
seems like that would be something that, you could have, the way it was explained and the trade-off between the kind of property they wanted to give us and the kind of property they could have that was within code, but maybe not as attractive, that seemed like something that you could have taken care of, as far as I'm concerned.
And I think some of that, really we're trying to look at the really more minor adjustments, which do get deferred to staff. And I feel like at some point, and maybe that's the line in the sand, where's the comfort level where it immediately goes over that? Is it 10? Is it beyond 10%? What is that numeric standard? And then maybe under what circumstance? And I'm not thinking we're going to address everything tonight. And so what I really am seeking from the commission is what examples would you like to see with this? I was really kind of honing in on this infill thing because I know we kind of dismissed it, but I felt like as part of the efficiency measures, it's like another add-on, in my opinion. I was like, this really kind of needs to be addressed. And the gentleman that showed up, I felt like that was a reasonable request. And I was like, and something it's not new. We've been talking about this for a while, about the code, and it's really restrictive. And if you're talking inches, but you got to do you have to do a public hearing variance just for inches. That's kind of crazy. when you're at that point.
Do you personally like the idea of a broad numerical variance that you could play to any aspect, or do you like for yourself more strict, like, 5% on lot size, period?
I mean,
Kind of restrictions. How do you feel about that?
And great question. I think what I've seen a lot of jurisdictions do is they have a type 1 process, and they're actually even more liberal than those example jurisdictions where they did a type 1 up to 10%, and then they graduated it and said 10 to 15% or 10 to 20% is a type 2, and then beyond 20% is a type 3. That's, again, it depends on the jurisdiction and like the sensitivity, and sometimes it almost maybe comes down to certain dimensional standards. I think lot area doesn't seem a huge deal. A 10% deviation to the lot area doesn't seem that big of a deal in terms of the overall magnitude. A setback variance of 10% equally is not a huge deal. I mean, 10% is not much of the dimensional standards. You're not talking huge amounts. Same probably with height, because it's probably going to be relatively, that again is another one of those items, but I think those are, and also impervious surface. So I would be relatively comfortable with either a type 1 or type 2 process up to 10% for those standards. I mean, I would feel like that would give us tools in our toolbox to make, things a lot more flexible in that degree. It's still not like, there's still a process, and somebody still has to file information with us. They still have to pay a permit. They still have to go through a fairly rigorous process depending on what the criteria are, and then it goes out for notice, and somebody could technically appeal that, which is another reason why we have to have it defensible. So, because it end up with, before you all, if it got here, and we always think about that, which is we're making a decision in context of an appeal, and can we defend it? So I would say that up to 10% as a type 1 or type 2, in my opinion, that's a good starting point. I would be okay with it going more than that. But I think, right now we allow 10% up to in setbacks and signs. We don't allow anything on lot area or lot coverage or height. So if you do inches on any of those, you're in a type 3 public hearing variance to do inches of adjustment.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a process question?
Yeah.
Okay, so you said on type 1, those don't need to be noticed or properly noticed. Are you, is planning wanting the ability to make decisions within a certain threshold? In other words, before it even needs to come to planning commission, like, hey, you've got this much of a buffer. The planning department makes the call themselves, whether it's approved or not, and then, or recommended for approval, and then they pass it up to commission to formally adopt. Is that how the process for type 1 would work?
It would really be type 1 and type 2. You would never see that. The planning commission would be administratively authorized, and again with criteria for that. And then unless it reached a type 3 quasi-judicial level, which is where the planning commission at, you would never see it.
Got it.
Unless it was appealed, if it was a type 2 and got appealed. And so most recently, all our type 2 decisions, and we've made a habit of this, is that we've actually posted that online as well. So in addition to the radius, because we feel like that's important, like somebody really has a question about that, here's all the materials, if you have, and here's the process if you want to appeal it. So we've made that fairly obvious and intentional, so that if somebody wants to really do that, to take it to planning commission, they have all the evidence to go through. Of the last 3 we've had, there's been no appeals. But we want to make that clear, so it's not also feeling like it's being made, under the cover of night, so to speak. So it's like transparent, and people are aware of that. Neighbors would be noticed in a type 2. They clearly know what was happening, and they could speak to that. Brian, go ahead.
Don, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I was going to add one caveat, which is, depending on the project, the planning commission could see it anyway if it was on a project that already had to go through design review. So this would only be certain classes of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but some larger projects, if it has to go through a type 3 design review anyway, then you actually would see it even if a smaller project, you wouldn't see it.
Excellent point, Ryan. So if you had a subdivision, that would be, I guess, great point. I'm thinking more like small projects, and again, my focus is on the infill. I'm thinking of Commissioner Ewert here, but that's kind of. But Ryan's absolutely correct. So like when we get to that, I guess the question is should there be some discussion, on that piece of it? Like, I mean, it obviously, if it was bundled with something that went to you because it's another part of another project for design review or subdivision. Should there be a limit to how many lots get the adjustment? That would be another consideration here. And that's not exactly where I was going with this, but I mean, there could be some upper end limits to this. I'm thinking like somebody has a, almost 14,000 square foot lot. They're almost there. Should they really be prohibited from, if they really want to do that, and it's really challenging to put another house on infill, but if they wanted to do that, should we be discouraging them from that?
So I personally, when you mentioned this, kind of that sliding scale, I was kind of a fan of that, 10%, kind of like a flat rate of 10% on all items at type 1, and then over 10 up to 20 type 2, and then beyond for type 3. I think that makes a lot of sense, but can you play devil's advocate and say where would that not work, or where would that create problems?
And I think part of that is, I mean, it might be good as, just for discussion purposes, we could come back with, and I think as a starting point, I think what it does is we could go through, and I haven't done that tonight, but we could go through the various zones and identify what that would mean. And maybe that would be helpful, put some sort of table together, because we'll have more discussion than tonight. And maybe that table is kind of a matrix, and it talks about here's what would happen under 10%, 20%, and you could go through the various standards and then make that decision. And if you want to grade it and say, okay, the gradation is type 1 up to 10%, and then that would be authorized. Type 2 is between 10 and 20 or 10 and 15. That's a type 2, and then beyond that is type 3. And so I think that might be helpful. And to be honest, it's not going to be just residential. It'll be across the board. It'll be commercial and industrial as well. So we're going to have to do this kind of ubiquitously. The lens really is largely now on housing, which is really why this is being brought up, because I feel like we're already moving things forward, and this is not something that consultants are involved with. And so I felt like this was like, especially if somebody's asking and saying, I'm just a little bit short of this, but I can't do what I'm trying to do. And today's housing market, it just seems like it would be a good thing to encourage that.
I'd like to see some kind of examples of what 10% really means in reference to some of these criteria. Because if you're talking about 10% on, say, height, if the max is 35 feet in an R2 and we're talking about 10%, are we talking about 10% more could be allowed? So instead of a 35-foot building, it would be 38 and a half feet?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, I mean,
That's much more than inches.
no, and I agree, but I think, in terms of like, well, currently though, we don't allow anything. So what I'm saying is you could be 3 inches above that 35 feet, and technically you need a variance, 35 feet and 3 inches. Now, that doesn't come up very often, but like technically that would need a variance. So I think that, and height, to be honest with you, I'm much less focused on height than I am like the lot area, percentage of impervious surface, and setbacks. Those three, I think, are critical to any success for infill. I don't think height is as big of a deal.
If
Yeah,
that,
go ahead.
if that were to come up, they could still be told no, though, right? Like it would still be an application process, and they could still be told no by staff that they can't do that. If it was going to be up to 38 feet and a half feet, is that correct? Can they? I mean, it doesn't mean they automatically. It's a yes. It still has to be reviewed, right?
So part of that is the criteria. So that would be, again, the bundle is. The first is the process, and then the second part is what criteria would you like to have? And I would say as we start to incrementally increase that, the criteria probably need to get more challenging. I mean, so like 10% is, I'm not sure if what we have in our code now, to be honest with you, for generally speaking, 10% in most circumstances, and I agree there could be some differences of opinion here, but I don't think that materially in most circumstances is even perceptible, really. I mean, I think the impact just is not that much, but beyond 10%, it starts to get a little bit more like, okay, when I'm starting to perceive this. So then the criteria should, I think, be scaled to that. It kind of feels like we have criteria now that's more like in the 20% category, in my opinion, than we do in a 10%. But that, again, we can discuss that as well in terms of not only presenting this from what this means materially at the next work session based on setbacks, but we could also talk about what jurisdictions have decided to do in terms of their criteria. And these are, again, they're somewhat discretionary, to be honest with you. I mean, all of this is discretionary. And so that, I guess the question becomes, how much of a unique burden situation are we going to ask somebody to provide for a smaller adjustment? The lot may or may not. I mean, you could come up with an argument that a lot is unique in different ways, but I mean, we could also, we could, to the point, we could deny it as well. I mean, if we felt like that was not meeting the criteria, what I'd like to avoid is when we have like the 10% criteria, I'd like to not have those so aggressively, like those should not match to the type 3 hearing variance criteria. They should not match, or we will defeat the entire process. So no one will ever be successful with that.
Yeah, with height specifically, that's something that I'd like to have a larger discussion about. Because if you're saying, oh, somebody asked for 3 inches more, great, have a 1% exception that can just be automatically waived. But I think something I'd like to, at some point, discuss with the group is when we're looking at the R2 development, are we ever going to take into consideration the existing housing around it? Because there's a huge difference between a 2-story building at 28 feet next to a 1-story building and a 35-foot plus next to it. That really affects a large swath of neighbors and neighborhoods when you put in something 3 stories next to a bunch of 1-stories. And that I would be interested to say, like, that should maybe be a consideration of, do we allow the full 35, or is less than 35 maybe more appropriate in some situations? Because we do want to encourage more building, but do we want to destroy the character of Canby by having all these neighbors who just are looking at a towering building in their backyard?
Isn't 35, though, the current limit? 35, and
that's the number right now.
It is, yes.
And there's nothing to restrict that in any way, shape, or form under any circumstances as it stands
So
now.
what can you do, say, in a 38 feet versus 35? I mean, what are we talking here?
Well, I think you're probably talking pitch of the roof. I mean, that's, and again, I think there's a compatibility component to Commissioner Driscoll's point that, I mean, I'm well aware of that the situation maybe, some of it could be, like it's just taller and it's not matching up. So compatibility is an issue. But I would say that what we're saying is, probably pitch of roof is probably the bigger, I mean, if it was, and again, maybe the scale on roofs, maybe that's, another category where like within a certain parameter, maybe that's, 5% or less, or maybe it's, within 2% or 3%. I'm again, that doesn't come up as often, but we do end up, height is not something that's never comes up, but it's not as often as like, I can't even start this process because I don't want to go through a full-blown public hearing variance because I'm off by 400 square feet of lot area to put another home on it. I think that's a bigger issue.
Yeah, but, and there'll be my last comment on the height thing. It really depends on what it's next to, if it matters or not. If you've got a 28, 29-foot 2-story house and a 38-foot building next to it, it's not that big of a deal. If you've got a 18-foot house with a 38-foot building next to it, that's really where you're going to see a difference.
That's legit. I have a 1-story house and I have a 2-story townhome next to me, and they can look right down into my
And that's
windows.
only 1-story difference. And then when you're talking
no, it's
3 versus 1.
I see what you're saying. It's definitely a consideration.
When it comes to the impervious area, Maybe we could consider the impervious area being something where it's adding functional use to the property. So when we had to approve those 5 duplexes a month or so ago, they don't have a walking path from the driveway to every doorway of those units. And to me, that's a travesty. Nobody should have to rent a place, and you can't get from your car to your door or from your car to your mailbox without trudging through the mud all winter long. Some people physically can't do that, and it's an inconvenience at best for somebody who's physically not affected. But we shouldn't be, like, it would have been a variance to have them have a little bit more of that impervious area. So they redid the plans, they dropped it, and ultimately we were approving a revised version and not the full pathway one. So for me, I would be like, yeah, sure, give them the pathway. That makes more sense. That's better housing stock for the city long-term than to say, no, it's a variance, so they're just going to exit out in what was being presented to us. To me, that would have been an administrative thing that I would have been comfortable with turning over to you guys.
And I think we start to get into some design considerations, and this is where we have to be somewhat careful, because, that's kind of the direction the state's pushing back a little bit on, because it does affect costs the more design elements you have, but some basic parameters around good practice of, like, functionality, to your point. I think those would be part of what I would say would be justifiable criteria to, those are the kind of unique situations that would be helpful for staff, as we go through this. I mean, I kind of cringe, to be honest with you, when, like, how close are they? And, like, we can't do it. I mean, it's just, and it does make sense, and so it's kind of the reasonableness factor is really what these adjustments are, is, it's, because as much as people, the code is the code, well, it doesn't fit every circumstance or every piece of property. It just doesn't. It can't really. I mean, it's a kind of a blanket, and it's,
So could we then take each category that you're looking to get clarity on, battle test at different percentages, and then just go from there, as opposed to kind of tackling it on a global level, and then hopefully getting specific through that process, maybe just reverse it.
I mean, I think if I'm hearing you correct, I think we could go to the development standards and just, I think, table that out. There's going to be peripheral issues that come out, I totally understand. Let's stay away from those, and then we can drill those back down. But I do think that's important, because I think when you start to see it, some of these are going to, like, this is no big deal at all. Why are we even talking about it? Other things, like, this is a big deal. I mean, it really depends on what the standard is, and then to some degree where geography it is in the city, and that could be another element, as well as, proximity to other land uses, and those kinds of things could be baked into the criteria. So
Yeah, I think with conditions, a lot of this would make sense. Like, if you're talking about, should we be making exceptions to reduce parking? Well, how wide is the street that it's on? If you've got a 40-plus foot wide street, well, hey, you can park on both sides of the street, cars can still go by, no problem. If you got a 20-foot wide street, heck no, because you can't park a car on both sides of the streets and still have cars be able to get down in either direction. So I think there's a little bit of just kind of a if-then situation that would make the most sense for me to be comfortable endorsing some of this. Is, it's not that we shouldn't be able to give you guys more flexibility, but that there need to be some specific guardrails to make sure that we're not unintentionally making our neighborhoods less livable and less enjoyable.
And I think those are all really good points, and I think test driving this is really I think it'd be helpful. And I wasn't trying to lead this. I wanted the global thing, like, we like this, or we're like, this is what we want you to kind of explore, versus, like, because this is not intended to be a hearing, really. It's intended to be exploratory and in its nature.
I think that meeting coming up on the 14th, if it was explained, like, you're going to have to make all these different categories fit, and there was like an exercise people are going to participate in. That's kind of what I'm envisioning with this, is like, give us a criteria, let's battle test it, let's try to poke holes in it, come up with a standard for each one, height, impervious, whatever, and just kind of move through the whole list that way. I think that would be super beneficial.
And I think that really would be, I think it'd be helpful to start to see what the code actually allows and does not allow. I think it also might be a good lens to like revealing other things in the code, which I'm sure will come up, like, why does this exist? And which is another bucket list item probably altogether that will come out of that.
How soon will we probably be able to move into that phase?
I'm planning to, you mean the whole like code update?
Yeah, well, I mean, no, I mean, like, going through each part of this criteria.
Yeah, I was going to say we don't have anything for September 25th, so I'd like to put that on. I mean, I can definitely do that.
Cool.
And so we can jump right into that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Specific to the slide that we have up on our screen, so has anyone had an opportunity to look at the infill? If we did have a 10% variance allowance, how many more homes and tax lots would be available?
And I was going to jump, I have some more
Is that
slides. And
further?
again,
Okay.
it doesn't quite answer your question, but Laney, could you advance that, please? So this is the area, and you saw this before, and this is kind of just a good sample, we felt, because it was larger lots. And this is the part where Commissioner Ewert was saying, if you just like infill, we would have no issue with housing here. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but I think I also want to take the value of the statement, though, which is, even though I'm going to show you it's limited, could there be an increase in that if with a small adjustment? So, next slide, Laney. So those lots that are in yellow, this is one section of this, and again, I'm going to show you only the sections that were successful. Some of them had no lots colored, meaning that there was no possibility of any infill whatsoever in that area. So this, again, is pretty high level, and it's not a deep dive, but in terms of like this administrative variance process. But all these lots, I think, would benefit from some sort of administrative process and make it easier to develop those, and would incentivize that, because I would say that we are probably optimistically viewing those yellow lots, and people on them might say, are you crazy? That would never work, for all these reasons.
Yeah.
But like just on the very high level. But this again kind of gets back to two things. Could these be easier to develop as infill? Secondly, would there be more yellow lots with small adjustments to the administrative variance process? Next slide, Laney. So these are, again, another sample, and there's only 3 here, but again, the same question, and we have not, what I was thinking about, again, I'm not sure if I'm going to have that exercise completed if we want to go down that path. Well, how many more lots would end up, I would first like to have you guys land on like, is it administrative or not? Because I think if it's a type 3, I would say that probably you're not going to get people to do infill. I'm just guessing. It's a big hurdle. So this would be like standard allowable, but I would say the number of lots in yellow, depending on what the adjustments were, would increase. Next slide, Laney. And this kind of shows some of the challenges really essentially with, and I won't go through this in detail, but with a 12-foot drive that's needed to access the back, where we're showing a conceptual home on this property, we got a 20-foot setback off one side, 7 foot, and 20 foot and 7. So again, super, super tight, small driveway. And again, that's part of the consideration. And again, it's not all about the infill. There's the tool for administrative variances is much broader than that. But since we're talking about housing, and that's kind of the what we're focused on right at the very moment, it's one of those items that you can start to see that like small things would be a big thing for something like this. Next slide, Laney. So this is kind of, again, observations, again, on the infill that, many homes don't have sufficient space for a 12-foot access. Many of them don't meet the 7-foot side yard setback. Having that 7,000 square feet is difficult to achieve. And the lot frontage on these is also a factor as well. So that would be another part of this. Would be another example. Would be lot frontage. Just making a note. And then just kind of in general, like this is an area that does have bigger lots, and so just for sake of argument, the smaller lot areas that have already developed, they're not going to be able to use the tool. I mean, they were already maxed out, but like, it kind of gets into like the, bigger lots that might just marginally not meet the standard would benefit. Next slide, Lainey. So that leads us to the, questions and comments, which we were already diving into.
Along the lines of the infill, I mean, not having the side setback really has a negative impact for a lot of existing neighbors and neighborhoods. I mean, because when you say there's not the existing 7, that means that there is actually a paved area literally feet from somebody else's house, possibly their bedroom window. I've got a neighbor who has a driveway 4 feet from their bedroom window right now. And it's not just a driveway, it's like a road. And I wouldn't wish that on anybody. That's just not like a great quality of life. So when we're looking at, can we get a couple more houses in, ultimately, is it worth it to then make so many other existing houses less pleasant? Because just in that example you were showing on 9th, the house that would partition its lot and the house next to it would be negatively impacted just to cram a little house in the back. And that wouldn't be something I would necessarily advocate for. If somebody desperately wanted to do it, I guess we could talk about it, but.
And some of this, I think, maybe is in light of, is the type of home that would be maybe infill, is it the same? Are you dealing with single family to single family, or are you dealing with, and again, maybe not so much the zoning, but if it's single family to single family, I think that perhaps goes away to some degree versus like, where you have zoning and you're zoned multifamily and that has not really materialized over time, and suddenly you've got something that doesn't necessarily fit into the area. I think we need to be careful about some of these items on multifamily, and that was, again, it needs to be explored, but I think that's something that has more possible impacts, and that would go back to the criteria, which would have to be, even our current code talks about, compatibility issues, so I think that does play to that. I'd see less of an issue with compatibility between 2 single-family lots. One, there's a lot, and then there's another lot next door to it. They're both single-family. I mean, I don't really see that any different than any other neighborhood. I mean, that's really what's allowed now, but it's just they're slightly off on their meeting the standards.
I understand we're exploring it because we kind of have to, but just thinking, just in general, the concept of infill, it doesn't feel like Canby, from my perspective at least, it doesn't feel like Canby's really receptive to that anyways. I know the 5 units that are going in on 4th is obviously a different situation because that resident had passed, the lot got sold, et cetera. But the concept of looking at that map, seeing how tight that would be, Canby does not give off the idea that they would want to do that, want to squish that in so far. Everyone seems to like having their little extra bits of space, even the new construction going in over and over. One of the number one complaints is, wow, these lots are a lot smaller. So I understand we have to explore it, but I just don't see it as a super viable option because you have to have people willing to be able to do that.
And so noted, and perhaps, more universally, maybe even without the infill, I am a strong proponent of having some adjustment level in our code, whether it's commercial, industrial. It's super challenging to not have flexibility in jumping immediately to a full-blown variance. So whatever that standard is for something rather small, I mean, it just the purity of saying the code, if you're a few inches off is just, that doesn't feel right. I mean,
Where I
Yeah.
see that is a mixed-use project
Yeah.
on 99 at some point,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we're talking
Yeah.
a few feet
Yeah.
because of existing lots and all this other nonsense. And so it does seem like a very practical thing to have in place. We're just super hyper-focused on Mr. Ewert's.
Well, he's not here to defend
With all due
himself.
respect, Mr.
It's like, Dan, we've had all these conversations. Come on, man.
A lot of the
Yeah, it's
infill
like-
happened already.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just follow
Yeah.
along
No, I
Knightsbridge
get it,
and look
yeah.
at how many flag lots
mean-
there are there. And it's like,
Yeah.
you know, nice idea, but they thought of it.
No, and I think part of it is, to be honest with you, those ones that were shown in yellow, if there was that much of a market demand, they probably would end up
Would have done it.
already developed. But again, I'm just trying to honor that request because like, I don't want to get to the housing needs analysis, which you will be hearing about in work session on October 23 and saying, if we only did this, we would not even be here. It's like, no, dude, it's like, doesn't work that way. Sorry. So anyway, I'm just sorry, being a little bit expressive here, but yeah, I just, but I also feel like, I feel strongly that we've needed this tool for a while, and it just, this has become like, okay, if we're ever going to talk about this, we should probably bring it up now, because, you know, so, because I do think, you know, it is important, like, that we look at that and say, well, could we just make that the case, and like, everything magically doesn't, there's no demand. Well, there really isn't. I
So
mean,
we have to look at it through the lens of, there's all these other types of projects that this type 1 process could apply to, but we have to be aware of the fact that it also could apply to the rare happenstance that an infill project.
Exactly, and I think that really, I mean, we're largely focused on housing and the comp plan and kind of the efficiency measures, and I'll give some updates during the planning director report about where we're going with the rest of those, you know, the items. But yeah, I think it's one that I feel like needed to be explored, because again, we will be going into work session anticipated October 23 on housing needs, and coming back for that whole like affordability discussion and those things leading up to a hearing probably early next year on that. And so I kind of want to diffuse to some degree these items that may not be relevant, but they're kind of like out there, like, well, if you only looked at this, you know, it'd be good.
Right.
But at the same time, I also feel like pragmatically that it's important to have some tool to have adjustments with, and to, you know, and it can be limited. And it's interesting how diverse these jurisdictions are. Like some of them, like, that must have been pretty lively discussions to get to the point that it was not universal, like 10% for this, 5% for this, 20% for this. I mean, those were obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. They had specific discussions about those. I'm sure those jurisdictions did. So I think the starting point maybe is going back with the table. And then if it's like, this is a non-starter, then maybe that development standard goes away. You know, we talk about other things, you know. Or we say that could be a lesser percentage of, you know, adjustment, but at least have something. It's nice to be able to say you can be within a certain amount and still do your project, but, you know.
So let's say
There's a couple ways that we could kind of come at this if we wanted to. I mean, we could start with the weeds, you know, and go through all of these criteria for the different types of zones we have, or we could just start. And I mean, 10% blanket variance seems like pretty huge. But I mean, if we wanted to just give them some flexibility in the short term, you know, a small percentage, you know, 3 to 5, just to get past the inches points for anything. And then, you know, I could see some percentages increasing, you know, I mean, there was some where people were looking at 20% variances for certain items, and we could always expand the conversation later and then see, you know,
Like,
how much gets opened up by, you know, 5%, and, you know.
Are you thinking of, like, you're differentiating by either zone or by project type? So like mixed use versus single family
Well,
versus?
I'm thinking about not differentiating at all. I'm thinking about, you know, essentially trusting our staff with a small amount of flexibility, and then seek to expand it later as necessary if they come up with a good argument to do so. And, you know, at the very least, it would untie their hands for any, you know, silly little, you know, technicalities if, things start happening and someone can't get a hearing on the boards here for several months, it would be nice if they could just get that thing going. But, and just to keep us from being overwhelmed by suddenly seeing things that seem out of proportion to its neighborhood, keeping it small to start with and giving them something to work with before we dive deep into every possibility. I mean, I'm all for discussing this stuff, and it seems like with development slowing down, we've got more time to chat. This is all kind of working out well with all the planning that needs to happen now. So, I'm down for it all. I'm just saying that there's a couple of different ways that we could come at this, and if we wanted to.
Well, let's just say that we have those discussions and we all agree on it's X amount for this and X amount for that, blah, blah, blah. Again, those are just recommendations that we're sending up to council to approve as well, correct?
It is, and I'm kind of
I just
in
wanna
the
make
same
sure.
light as the housing efficiency measures, and again, this is beyond that because it's broader, but I feel like bundling that together, going forward, that was kind of my thought. We would end up having the cottage developments, planned unit developments, and commercial zones along 99, south side of 99, more flexibility on allowing residential in those areas. Those three, and then my vision was that we might end up having this parallel process with the minor variances adjustments. But again, that could end up taking a life of its own. I don't want it to derail the other three, but I felt like they do somewhat, at least to the extent of this all coming back to the housing needs analysis piece of this, which is kind of running separate from that, but that issue about, how much infill can actually do in the city, and maybe the issue really is less about the focus on that and more about giving us some latitude to have the ability to make these adjustments so that there's at least some standard beyond zero. Zero is not a good standard. It's just.
Specifically with 99 development.
0.01. That's what you get. Sorry.
Specifically where we're looking at 99 development, like the biggest concern that I have with any kind of latitude we'd be looking at granting for those developments is just really taking into consideration what the visibility is for getting in and out of those properties. ODOT will not put so much as a no right turn sign in front of a building until enough people have died there. They don't care about accidents, you gotta die. So we don't have control over something as simple as traffic control of people coming in and out of anything on 99. So if we're not mindful in what we're allowing in terms of design, then we're going to be causing traffic issues and fatalities eventually as 99 gets busier and busier, because certain times of the day, you really shouldn't be taking a right-hand turn, 10 feet away from the lighted ivy in 99 or whatnot. But we have all these buildings that have access points there and nothing to restrict people from doing something stupid. And I'm really concerned as people divert off of 205, how bad 99 is going to get. So I want to, support building it up where it's reasonable, but I don't want to make a variance. And now you're really right up on there, and anybody who's looking left or right from businesses anywhere along that road have that much less visibility to see what's going on, even for a safer, well, I was saying no right turn, but I meant no left turn. Like even a safer right-hand turn, maybe you still can't just see for visibility to know when it's clear to get on the road. Because right now it's already a problem in a lot of places.
And there'll be more discussion, all good points on those items. I think traffic mobility on 99 is it's a big issue. And I think some of this is to the point where some of that access, you may end up having a right in, right out situation where, that left-hand movements, over time may not be something that we will allow. I mean, just whether or not ODOT's involved, it's their highway, they have to review projects, but that also has to go through our lens as well on many of these projects.
Yeah, we can restrict how it's
Yeah.
built, maybe the way that it's designed is you can only come in and out the way we would want people to.
And it's kind of interesting because I haven't explored this. There's another House bill, there's always a new House bill that's out by the legislature, and it's about allowing outright residential inside of commercial buildings. And that's another piece that we have to get our hands around that too, but it's not exactly what we're suggesting in this review of the 99, because we were thinking more independent buildings and not using existing commercial buildings. But there's legislation already in place that we'll talk more about that as well. But I think, part of this is it's important on access to make sure it's safe and that it's reviewed. And I think it depends on the nature of this. A brand-new building would go through design review, and it would go through the planning commission. Something that was a modification could go to the planning commission if it was attached, if the value was more than 60% of the underlying value of the property, and the building would go to the planning commission. So I think a lot of these that we're talking about that would be like new buildings that would end up happening would have severe scrutiny to them about, those items that you brought up about concerns about safety. And to the extent that the driveways might need to be modified so you can't make movements that are dangerous and that would cause problems. And those are part of that review and part of your purview as well.
Okay, but I got to know, are you saying that they're saying that XYZ Auto Parts store could suddenly vacate and people could just move in there and live there as a domicile?
Well, you obviously have to meet certain building codes, and again, I need to come back with a report on that fully, but that is very recent legislation, so.
I think they're looking at vacant commercial property downtown mainly, but that's a case across the country.
You could start I believe the intent is you could start occupying structures, but again, you have to have habitability. You can't put people in a garage.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not the smartest move, but they'll do it.
So there are certain standards, but yeah, it's interesting because, there's this desperation around, affordability. And so we're just trying to keep up with it all. But so that conversation, regardless of where we go with our end of things on this idea, for efficiency measures is already in play because the state has already put it out there, in part that whole notion of now whether or not commercial would generate, more or less than residential, those are other discussions, or different hours of operation would be different. There's a lot of dynamics to that. In fact, maybe commercial would generate more. But again, it's another avenue for discussion. And I do agree that, access and those kinds of things are critical.
Well, judging by your page number, you were at 16 of 16.
I am 6, yeah.
So should we put a bow on this topic for tonight, since we're going to be?
Yeah, and I would say that, just on the, I'm happy to the commentary about going into the extreme weed patch. I will try to avoid that because I'm getting the sense of some, I can see with this. No, I was visualizing weeds too with graphs and stuff, and it's like I will try to keep it simple, but I think it would be helpful to have some tables that are, broader, and we drill this down further in terms of what does this really look like and mean, and then that starts the metric, and then it starts the more discussion around criteria, which I think are generally consistent across those examples that I gave, but those are going to have to be crafted as well. But I think we start with how big of a deal do you think this is for these development standards? And then we move it into the criteria and then figure out, is type 1, type 2, what is that? Where does the type 3 fit in? Those are the discussions.
Okay, any other comments before we move on to our next?
Just because this is kind of crazy. The first zoning jurisdiction in the United States is Manhattan, right? And it was all about managing traffic between commercial and residential and industrial on the streets that they had because they were all jamming each other up. So that's kind of a big old hatchet, at the whole process of zoning. Is the idea is to kind of share the transportation infrastructure amongst ourselves so that we're not making ourselves miserable on one end of town while we're making money on the other end, doing the same thing. And so, yeah, that's crazy. There's a big old can of worms with that. And it goes all the way back to the beginning. So that should be fun.
Yeah. It's interesting, just on commentary, I mean, even going back less time than that, like just going back to the 60s and 70s, it was the same discussions. We're more sophisticated, we deal with things more quantifiably, but those discussions are the same. I mean, if you go back and look at records of hearings and those kinds of things, they were the same issues are present then than they are today. So it's, these are not new, to your point.
Okay. Items of interest.
So I'll jump into those. So we, again, September 25th, we'll continue the administrative variance discussions. We may have a hearing item on October 9. Haven't confirmed that 100%, but that looks like it will happen at this point. And then October 23rd, that we're hoping to have a work session on housing needs analysis. And there likely will be also a hearing that night on another project. Then November 13th, I don't have anything slated for that. But for November 27, we're looking at housing efficiency measures, and this is phase 2 of this. So this will come back, segue really of discussion, the cottage developments, planning unit developments, and residential along 99. Those 3 will start to come back in some sort of more defined elements of code and discussions around those as part of our efficiency measures. So that's launching into that. There'll be a number of work sessions, but that's the first one that we'll have. I don't have anything completely slated for December 11, and that's the last one of the year, and because the other one falls, I think, on Christmas, the Planning Commission. So I'm just already looking out into next year. Back to the comment on, just wanted to make sure everybody is aware, this Thursday, September 14th at 6 p.m., City Police Station will be having the first community summit on the comprehensive plan. That is really more the visioning and dealing with the vision for the city, getting people's input on that. And we'll have tables and reporting out on these tables. We're hopefully expecting a large crowd, and we're looking forward to that. And then the second community summit, which will have the puzzle pieces that Commissioner Ellison was speaking of, is on November 14. So just so that people don't get disappointed that they don't have puzzle pieces on September 14, just making that note for those watching. And then there'll be 2 more community summits, I think February and May 2024, and more to come on those discussions around that. Tomorrow I'll be going to the Clackamas County Board of Commissioners in the morning on the sequential urban growth boundary process work plan for their acknowledgement of that after the council's acknowledged that. So that's tomorrow morning. And that just kind of sets up a work plan for us that gives us some latitude on our timelines. I think that's about it. Oh, the economic opportunity analysis was approved by council on September 6th. So that's moved forward. So the EOA has been adopted. And I think that's about it for right now.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you for that. And do we have any items of interest or guidance from the Planning Commission?
I had a question. So I was thinking after we approved that, or made the recommendation for the medium level development for the UGB stuff, we're looking at 9 times as much industrial as we were residential. And I was kind of curious about why it was such a huge difference. Was that in part from one of the House bills that they had passed to try and bring in more industry?
It's related to the last 11 years of employment in terms of businesses developing here and the rate of employment for the city, and the council decided to move forward with the growth rate we've had in the last 11 years versus a growth rate lesser than that or greater than that. So those were the options. So that ends up resulting in the medium growth scenario, which is reflective of what growth growth we've had in the last 11 years.
So because we haven't developed residential over the last decade, we're not going to develop it over the next.
And residential is keyed in on population projections, which is
Yeah.
different than employment. So residential population projections of roughly 6,000 people generate a certain amount of housing based on a mix of housing, and that has a pretty complicated formula for buildable lands analysis. And the state also is very particular about the residential side of things on that, and we're even going down to residential density of existing developments, and they're asking for that information as part of that. So housing is a different formula than it is for employment. Both are important in the equation here, both to accommodate the housing needs as well as the employment needs of the city over the long run. And that's, again, that's really the starting point of that discussion about what the need is, and then from there, it's really the comprehensive plan that starts to formulate, issues around policies and those kinds of things. And there will be that's a good question you asked. There will be a city council work session, I believe it's November 1, that we will have with our consultants on more of a breakdown of those processes, how the comp plan, transportation system plan, and urban growth boundary all kind of interact together, and timelines on that. We'll have a specific work session on November 1st for that at council. So that, I don't have the details of the discussion yet, but just to give you more information.
Okay. Do we have a document somewhere that kind of shows like what the exact calculations were, like that kind of shows our work of how we calculated everything? If I want to be a nerd, could I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've already gave it to everyone in the past, and it just wasn't
so
something recent.
the August 14, and if, and I'm happy to send this to you as well, the August 14th online, if you go to the city website and go to Planning Commission for August 14, you look at the packet information, the report, the economic opportunity analysis report is in there. It's about 80 or 90 pages long, I believe. And it has the formulas that are included in there for how they went about their calculation. That was vetted by several people at Department of Land Conservation and Development as well, so they believe it's consistent with the state law on how that was calculated. But yeah, that should be.
I'm just really curious to see like how they broke it out, like what
Yeah.
the inputs were and like how they figured that. Not so much that I'm challenging it, I was
Yeah.
just curious.
Yeah. No, and there's a lot to it. There's a reason we hired economists or with the grant monies, because it is complicated.
Cool, thank you.
Any other comments, concerns, questions, items of discussion? No? Okay, then I think,
You ready for, I don't know if there's anybody online, Laney, nobody? Okay.
didn't see anything earlier or anybody join us, but I think we can entertain a motion to adjourn if we're ready. Is everybody ready?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Any seconds?
I'll second it.
Very well, let's start on our left with a roll call vote.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. We are adjourned for the evening. Thank you, City of Canby.